Today we're going to dive into a truly foundational paper, a 1988 piece by Barbara Levitt and James G. March titled Organizational Learning. It tackles a really fascinating puzzle. Why do smart, successful organizations sometimes get stuck, repeating the same mistakes or failing to adapt? This paper offers a powerful and honestly a pretty surprising answer.
So here's our roadmap for breaking down their argument. We're going to look at the scholarly conversation they were jumping into, then map out their core concepts, follow their line of reasoning, and finally we'll unpack their main claims and the legacy of this work.
Okay, so first things first. To really get what Levitt and March were doing, we have to understand the context. What were the dominant ideas about organizational behavior at the time, and what specific gap did they see that needed filling?
Well, a lot of the big theories back then treated organizations as these hyper-rational players, always calculating future moves, engaging in strategic bargaining. But Levitt and March argued for a different view. They said organizations are often more like creatures of habit, guided less by forward-looking strategy and more by routines that are baked in from past experiences.
These three observations you see here, they're really the bedrock of the entire theory. The idea that action is based on routines, that these routines are shaped by history, and that organizations are constantly measuring themselves against their goals, this is the fundamental behavioral lens they're using.
And this is a really important move. They shifted the focus away from just individual learning inside one company. By talking about ecosystems of learning, they're pushing us to see the bigger picture. A whole system of organizations all learning and adapting simultaneously, and in response to each other.
Okay, so now we know why they wrote the paper, to fill that conceptual gap. So let's get into the how. What are the actual building blocks of their framework? What are the key ideas we need to grasp?
This quote is everything. It's the whole idea in a nutshell. The core mechanism is right there. Organizations take what they've learned from history and they encode it. They bake it into routines, and those routines become the default operating system that guides future behavior.
And when they say routines, they mean something much broader than just a standard operating procedure in a manual. A routine could be the informal rules of a meeting, a company's deep-seated culture, its core technologies, its strategies. It's all the stuff that sticks around, even as individual employees come and go.
So let's trace the logic. An organization has an experience, it learns a lesson, and that lesson gets captured in a new or modified routine. The really powerful part is that this makes the lesson available to everyone, even people who weren't there for the original event. These routines get passed down through socialization and become part of the organization's collective memory.
All right, so we have the basic building blocks. Learning happens through routines. But now we need to deconstruct the process itself, because as Levitt and March lay it out, it's a lot messier and frankly more fascinating than it first sounds. The argument sort of unfolds in these 5 stages. It starts with the most basic form of learning, direct experience. But then it gets more complex. How is that experience interpreted? How is it remembered? How do organizations learn from watching others? And how does all of this play out in a competitive environment?
Now here's one of the most powerful insights of the paper. Learning isn't always good. It can go wrong. Think about the competency trap. This is when a company gets so good at an old way of doing things that it never bothers to learn a newer, better way. Or superstitious learning, when a company thinks it knows the secret to its success, but in reality, the connection is wrong. They've just been lucky.
So how do organizations remember these lessons, both good and bad? Well, the paper argues it's a 3-part process. Experience gets recorded in documents, culture, and so on. It's conserved and passed on to new people through socialization. And then it's retrieved from memory, with things used more frequently or more recently being the easiest to recall.
Of course, organizations aren't learning in a vacuum. They're watching each other. Sometimes they're forced to adopt a new practice because of regulations. That's coercive. Other times they just copy a successful competitor. That's mimetic. Or a practice becomes the accepted professional standard, so they adopt it to seem legitimate. That's normative.
And this brings us back to that huge complex idea of ecologies of learning. Just think about it. You're trying to figure out if your new marketing campaign worked, but at the same time, all your competitors are also changing their own strategies. It creates so much noise that figuring out true cause and effect becomes incredibly difficult. Okay, so we've walked through this intricate, sometimes messy view of how organizations learn. So what's the bottom line? What are the central claims that this new theory really puts on the table? You can really distill it down to these 5 core propositions. First, knowledge lives in routines. Second, learning can actually be a trap. Third, an organization's interpretation of history matters more than objective reality. Fourth, learning is a group sport, not a solo activity. And finally, putting it all together, organizational learning is a deeply flawed and imperfect process.
So let's wrap this up. What was the paper's ultimate contribution to the field, and what path did it lay out for future researchers to follow?
The major contribution, really, was to challenge the simple, optimistic idea that learning always leads to progress. By creating this framework that highlights the pathologies, the dark side of learning, they gave us a much more sober, realistic, and ultimately more useful way to think about how organizations actually change.
And their analysis points to some really deep structural problems that are just inherent to learning from experience. How do you learn from a 1-in-100-year flood? How do you stay innovative when what you're currently doing is working so well? And how do you know what works when your whole industry is in flux? These are not easy questions.
This, in turn, opens up some really big questions for future research. Can we design organizations to be more aware of their own learning biases? Is it possible that sometimes learning slowly is actually better than learning quickly? And what does intelligence even mean when you're talking about a whole community of organizations, not just one?
Which leaves us with this fundamental tension, a question that managers and scholars are still wrestling with today. If the very thing that makes you efficient, your routines, can also trap you, how do you build an organization that can perfect what it does today while also exploring what it might need to do tomorrow? That is the essential challenge.